Chapter 12. We're going to start there. And this is the, fourth section that we've looked at. And all these, Ezekiel's pretty easy to track and follow because it is in sections. And they build on each other. If you remember, the first three chapters is Ezekiel's calling and commission. It's about God calling him to be a prophet and what he's going to have to do. And so you those first three chapters, it's all about that. And then chapter 4 through 7 builds on that calling because Ezekiel's called to be a prophet. And in chapter 4 through 7 is about the judgment against Judah and Jerusalem. So it kind of builds on it. Then after chapter 4 through 7 is chapters 8 and 11 that we just finished. And that builds on that judgment theme of Judah and Jerusalem, and it goes into detail. Why they were judged, all the different sins that they were judged for, and all that. Now here's the problem that sets up the next section. So far we've looked at chapters 1 through 3, chapter 4 through 7, chapter 8 through 11. Now this section is chapters 12 through 19. And so we're going to look at 7 chapters. And the whole point behind chapter 12 through 19 is that the exiles never grasped the seriousness of the consequences of their sins. They never fully got it. And if you remember, we talked about this several chapters ago. One of the things that the exiles always thought about was Jerusalem is God's holy city. This is it. I mean, it's the center of everything. So as long as Jerusalem's upright, as long as Jerusalem's okay, then we're okay. So they kept thinking, as long as God delayed judging Jerusalem, then we're all going to be okay. And so even though Ezekiel is prophesying all these things, and he's saying, you guys are sinning, you got idols in the temple, you got priests that are behind this little secret wall, and they're worshiping these idols and all this. These exiles, some of them, hadn't grasped the seriousness of that, and so they thought that even when they do go into exile, they'll go back home pretty quick. It's going to be relatively quick. It's not going to be a big deal, kind of a slap on the wrist kind of thing, because as long as Jerusalem and Judah are okay, that's our security. So everything's tied up in that. And so then, and I'm going to run through these for you, and I'm going to run through they gave arguments. They gave Ezekiel arguments. So chapter 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19 are all about the exiles' arguments to Ezekiel on why Ezekiel's wrong. Ezekiel said, this is what God said, this is what's going to happen. You guys are going into captivity for so many years, hundreds and 400 and something years, not just a day or two, which is what they thought. We'll get captured, but God's going to let us go. And so when Ezekiel presented that to them, they started hammering out these excuses. And every excuse that they gave, Ezekiel then came back with a counter argument for it and said, well, that's really not right. And so these are their excuses. Today we're going to look at chapter 12. Chapter 12 is, the argument is going to be, if judgment is going to come against us, if we are going to be judged and go into captivity and all this stuff, it's not going to be in our lifetime. Ezekiel said it would, but it's not. That was their argument. And they used Jeremiah and Isaiah and some of those other prophets. So they got Ezekiel on one hand and Jeremiah and Isaiah on the other hand, and they're pitting them against each other. Like, well, Jeremiah said this, and I'm going to show you in just a minute why what Jeremiah said is actually what Ezekiel said. They're the same thing. I mean, it ties together. But that's their first argument. Their first argument in chapter 12 is, if this is really going to happen, if you're right, it's not going to be in our lifetime. It's it's way on down the road. Still a lot of people today. People today say, if Jesus really is coming back, it's not going to be in our lifetime. I mean, we got all the time in the world. And then their argument is, Paul thought it was going to be pretty quick. John thought it was going to be pretty quick. Peter thought it was going to be pretty quick. And so, since Jesus didn't come back in their time, we got all the time in the world. It's the same argument that they're making in chapter 12. When you get to chapter 13, the argument is, and I kind of told you this, their argument is Ezekiel's just one prophet. He's just one guy. And so they say a lot of prophets and even prophetesses, they will say that they give us a lot of reason for optimism. Ezekiel seems kind of doom and gloom. But there's other people out there who are more optimistic about it. They give us more hope. They're more, so we'll side with those people. You know, we rather go with them because they're more happy. That's chapter 13. Chapter 14, they say that their argument is, they say, okay, if all this other stuff's right, it's the leadership's problem why we're in captivity. They're the ones that did wrong. So if anybody's going to be judged, it's going to be the leaders in Jerusalem, not us exiles. You know, so, you know, we got an out because we didn't do it. You know, the leadership did it. So that's their argument in chapter 14. You get to chapter, the last part of chapter 14, and they say, and this is a bad one for them, because chapter 14 has two arguments. The second one is, if we are going to face judgment, all we got to do is find one righteous guy to stand up for us before God, and God will let us off the hook. You know, so we got to find one good guy. You know, if we find one good guy and let him cry out to God, because they're reminiscent about the time of the judges, you know. They go into captivity, God raises up a judge after the people cry out, God delivers them, they ain't right back in the same mess again. And so they're thinking, we're going right back into this judge cycle. If we do face judgment, we just need one guy. We don't need a whole group of people. We don't need a whole church. We just need one guy. And if one guy will raise up and help us, then God's going to let us off the hook. That's chapter 14. Chapter 15 and 16, the fifth argument is, I just say it like this. Their argument to Ezekiel is, how do you think, or how can you imagine that God's going to attack his own people? How can you tell us that God's going to go after his own folks? So that's their argument in chapter 15 and 16. The sixth argument is that they say it's not fair for God to judge us because of our forefathers' sins. If we're really being judged, nothing we did, it's what they did. And so they said, Ezekiel, what you're saying is we're going to be judged for something our ancestors done, and that's not right. God's not going to do that. And so Ezekiel has to deal with that. That's in chapter 17. Chapter 18, the seventh argument is, if judgment really is coming, there's nothing we can do to stop it anyway. You know, if God really is going to get us and all this stuff is true, there's nothing we can do. So they say, there's no reason for us to repent. I mean, if God says it's assured that you're going to be judged, then there's no reason for us to even try, because God's going to get us anyway. Chapter 19, the eighth thing, and we're going to talk about Zedekiah a little bit tonight. They say that Zedekiah, who was the contemporary ruler of Judah, the guy in charge at this time, they say he can be trusted even though he can't. And so they have an argument against Zedekiah, even though they know he's not the right guy that's supposed to be in power anyway. So chapter 12 through chapter 19 is just those arguments. Is the people of Israel, those exiles, telling Ezekiel, this is why we think that you're wrong. Now, the purpose of chapter 12 through 13, this whole section, is to show the worthlessness of that false security. That you guys are putting your faith in the wrong thing. So everything you're hoping for is worthless. And so that's what chapter 12 through 19 is. They'll say, this is what we think. Ezekiel will say, no, that's worthless to believe that. That's false sense of security. It's false sense. So people do that now. Think about the number of people now that commit a sin and it's years and they haven't got busted yet. And so they think, since God's let me get by with it for 5 years or 10 years, God's forgot about it by now. As long as the period of time goes by, the longer that time period goes, God certainly forgets about it, or God just doesn't care anymore. And so the mistake is to think that the passing of time means that God has suddenly forgotten, because he hadn't. And that's the argument here, is there's a worthless basis for the false security that these people have. And so Ezekiel in chapter 12 through 19 is going to tell them that. And he's going to tell them that everything that they're banking on, everything they're hoping on, is false. All right, so look at verse 1. And because this is divided up into several sections in chapter 12. Verses 1 through 7 is a section. And verses 1 through 7 is a sign of the departing deportees. And Ezekiel is going to use their argument and say that God is giving you a sign by the people that are being carried away that what he says is true. So look at verse 1. Because God is going to, remember, let me throw this word out again because it's a really weird word. We're going to talk about it several times. We call them pedagogian biographies. A pedagogy is a teaching style. It's you have a pedagogy of teaching. And you have all these, and if you ever taken an education class, you read about all these different teaching styles, and you'll find yourself adopting one. This is how you're going to do it. Most of the prophets, Jeremiah especially, Ezekiel especially, their teaching style was in what we call biography, pedagogian biography. In other words, they acted out the lesson. And so, if you remember, Ezekiel had to lay on his side for so many years. He had to stay quiet. God shut his mouth. He had to do these things in order to teach the lesson. And so, God is going to ask him now to do something that seems kind of weird to us, but God is using it because they're not getting the words. When Ezekiel tells them they're not getting it, so now God is going to give them a demonstration. So look at verses 1 and 2. 1 and 2, then the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Son of man, you live in the midst of the rebellious house, who have eyes to see but do not see. Remind you of today. Ears to hear but do not hear, for they are a rebellious house. Verse 2, therefore, what's the therefore? Because they are rebellious, because they're not listening, they have eyes to see but can't see, they have ears to hear but can't hear. Therefore, son of man, prepare for yourself baggage for exile, and go into exile by day in their sight, even go into exile from your place to another place in their sight. Perhaps they'll understand, though they are a rebellious house. So this is what he said. He said, and we believe theologically, chronologically, this comes right after the vision of chapter 8 and 11. Chapter 8 and 11 is one vision. This is kind of another vision. Come right after it. And so look what he said. Tells him a couple of things. He says, you live in the middle of rebellious people. They don't get it. And he talks about blindness and deafness. And he says that these people are blind to the things they see. I mean, they see them, but they don't see them. They see what's happening, but they're blind to it. And then he says they're deaf to the things they hear. They hear the warnings. Jeremiah's giving them warnings. Isaiah's giving them warnings. Daniel is going to eventually give them warning. He says they're blind to what they see. They're deaf to what they hear. He said, in Ezekiel, you're living right in the middle of them. They just don't get it. And so then look what he says. Pack your bag like an exile. He says, you're about to give another demonstration. And so basically, in our terminology, pack you up a suitcase. Throw some clothes in the duffel bag because you're about to do something. And look what he's going to do in verse 2. Go into exile from your place to another place where they can see you. He says, you're going to now give a biographical demonstration of what it means to go in exile. They don't understand. You're telling them that they're going to go in there for so many years, that they're going to have to cook food over dung, that they're going to be enslaved to the Babylonian. You're telling them all these things, but they don't get it. And you built this diagram of Jerusalem and you attacked it. They saw that, but they didn't get it. They're seeing and they're hearing, but they're not really getting it. He said, so now let's try something else. He said, I want you to pack a bag. Just throw some things together like you're leaving in a hurry. And I want you to exile yourself from your house to another place so that they can see. Because I want them to see in a visible demonstration of what an exile looks like. Somebody going from one place to another. And so that's what he's going to do. Now, sin's the overarching problem in all this. And sin, even now, blinds our hearts and minds. Sin keeps us from seeing. Samson is a good example. Samson couldn't see that the path that he had chosen, following Delilah and giving in to all those temptations, he couldn't see that was the end of his ministry. Sin does it. It blinds us to what's really happening. Samson's a good illustration. And so God said to Ezekiel, I want you to pack some bags, and I want you to get ready to exile yourself from one place to another. Now look at verses 3 and 4, because he's going to do what God says, which is always a pretty good thing. So verse 3, he says, verse 3, therefore, son of man, prepare for yourself baggage for exile, going to exile by day in their sight, even going to exile from your place to another place. I actually read that instead of verse 2, which is okay because we're here now. Perhaps they will understand, though they're a rebellious house. Look at verse 4. Bring your baggage out by day in their sight as baggage for exile. Then you'll go out at evening in their sight as they're going into exile. So this is where he gives him that instruction. It's a symbolic act. Pack a bag during the daylight hours as if you're going into exile. I'm sure he probably packed the bare necessities just like you would if you were taken away. And so he does it. God tells him to do it, he does it. Now look at verse 5. God gives him an additional instruction. Verse 5, dig a hole through the wall in their sight and go out through it. Load the baggage on your shoulder in their sight and carry it out in the dark. You'll cover your face so that you cannot see the land, for I have set you as a sign to the house of Israel. He says, okay, here's the next part of this little scheme, this little demonstration. He said, I want you to dig a hole, and the word that he uses here is the sun-dried brick of his house. And so he says, I want you to dig a hole through the wall of your own house. You're living in this house, and you got all your stuff here. Pack a bag, bare necessities, like you're being snatched away by an invading army, and then dig a hole in your own house, and then crawl through it, like you're leaving. So that's what Ezekiel's called to do. Ezekiel is called to pack this bag and head out. Look at what it says about it. Do it so they can watch. They're going to be watching you all day because you're going to be packing these bags and putting on digging this hole and all this stuff. And then when nightfall comes, you're just going to crawl through the hole. You pass through the hole. Now, it's an unusual method of departure. Now, nobody leaves their house by cutting a hole in the wall. Most people just go out a door. Yes, open front door and go out. But here he called Ezekiel to do something very odd, and it's odd for a reason. He tells him to do this really unusual thing because departing through a hole in the wall at night speaks of secrecy and desperation, which is basically what a Babylonian invasion is going to be about. Just come in and get you. Then he told him to cover his face. He said, cover your face so you can't see the land. It probably represents the inability of the exiles to see the land, or to put some shame on them for having to depart the land that God had given them. You just cover your face and do it. It has another meaning too that we're going to get to it in just a minute, because somebody else tried to do this. And God got him. So that's Ezekiel's. That's his commission from God. That's his orders. Pack a bag, wait till night, dig this hole, crawl through the hole, show the people what it's like to leave. Now look at verse 7. I did so as had been commanded. One of the best verses in Scripture, because every time God asks us to do something, that's our response. I did just like he commanded. God asked me to do it, I do it. Don't really argue, don't really negotiate. I just do what God asked me to do. So he said, I did as I had been commanded. By day, I brought out my baggage in like the baggage of an exile. Then in the evening, I dug through the wall with my hands. I went out in the dark, carried the baggage on my shoulder in their sight. He said, I did just like God said. I did all that he commanded him to do. I went out and I did it. Now, the reason that I think God does it like this, if you want to jot this down and go back and read it, in Jeremiah chapter 52, verse 7, because Jeremiah is prophesying about the same occasion, Zedekiah, who is a illegitimate ruler of Judah, tries to escape like this. He covers his face, he puts on a disguise so nobody recognizes him, and he tries to sneak out in the middle of the night. And so I think God is kind of doing this prophetically, because Zedekiah is actually going to try to do it when everything happens at that time. Now look at verse 8. Because verse 1 through 7 is a section. Now verses 8 through 16 is a section. This is the explanation of what he just asked Ezekiel to do. He asked Ezekiel to give a sign of deportees that are leaving, show them what exile looks like. Now there's going to be an explanation for it. Look at verse 8. In the morning, after all this stuff, in the morning the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Son of man, has not the house of Israel, the rebellious house, said to you, what are you doing? The morning after Ezekiel did this little miracle, this little drama, God spoke to him again. This time, he reminded Ezekiel that the Jewish people had asked Ezekiel what all this was about. He said, did they ask you what this is for? And so now God is going to explain it. Look at verse 10. God says, say to them. He said, in the morning, didn't they ask you what all this was about? This is what you tell them. Say to them, thus says the Lord God, this burden concerns the prince in Jerusalem as well as all the house of Israel who are in it. So Ezekiel is going to explain to them that the oracle that was delivered to him, this prophecy that was given to Ezekiel, that Ezekiel gave to the people, concerned King Zedekiah. That's what verse 10 is about. The prince in Jerusalem. They call him a king because he's really not the rightful king. He calls him a prince. So he says, when they ask you what this was all about, basically tell them it has to do with Zedekiah. Tell them it's all about him. Ezekiel, Jeremiah, Isaiah, most legitimate Jews, Zedekiah was not the right guy. Jehoiakim was the legitimate king. And so God said, you tell them this is about that prince that's over in Jerusalem. Tell them it regards him. Then he's going to give further explanation. Look at verse 11. Say, I'm a sign to you. As I have done, so it will be done to them. They will go into exile, into captivity. The prince, Zedekiah, who tries to escape in the middle of the night, the prince who is among them will load his baggage on his shoulder in the dark and go out. They will dig a hole through the wall to bring it out. He will cover his face so that he cannot see the land with his eyes. He says, you tell him it's about King Zedekiah. Then verses 11 and 12, he says, explain to them that I'm a sign about those other ones about captivity. And he says, I'm not representing the guys I'm with. It's not about you guys that are with me here in exile. He said, it's about the ones that stay behind in Jerusalem. Because remember, there's that group that went out, and there's a group that stayed behind. That group that stayed behind said, oh man, we got it made. We're still in Jerusalem. This is God's place. And then chapter 11 was all about, no, you got it backwards. The ones that are in exile are the ones that are going to be saved. The ones that are in Jerusalem are the ones that are going to be destroyed. You guys got it backwards. And so now he says, I'm just reminding you, Ezekiel, you tell these people, those that are around you in exile, this is not about them. This is about Zedekiah and all those people who are left behind. They think they've got it made. They think that they're God's chosen, that God's not going to do anything to them, that as long as they're in Jerusalem, they're saved. You tell them it's about those people. And then look what he says about Zedekiah. He said that prince that's over there, when all this invasion stuff comes along, this is what Zedekiah does according to Jeremiah chapter 52. So the Babylonians are racing through. They're kidnapping all these people. They're ransacking the city, killing all those folks. So Zedekiah gets his little brain trust, his little entourage, and they disguise him up. That's why they put a cloth over his face, put a hat on, sunglasses, fake beard and all this kind of stuff. And they dug a hole through the wall, and they said, come on, Zedekiah, we're going to go out this way. And so they try to sneak out and leave everybody else in there to suffer the consequences. He said, this is what this is about. That's what God is telling Ezekiel. You tell the exiles you're with that they're okay. This is about those guys because their priorities are wrong. They're messed up. And so that's what this is about. Now look at verse 13. Because remember, Zedekiah is trying to escape. Him and all those leaders have convinced the people in Jerusalem to sin. They're the ones that caused all the problems according to chapter 11 and 10. And so now when the fire's turned up, they're all going to try to abandon ship and leave all those people to suffer in Jerusalem. And Zedekiah and them is just going to go live merrily alone. So look at verse 13. I will also spread my net over him, because the ancient art depicted kings and all of hunting birds, quail, stuff like that with nets. And so God's using an image here. I'll also spread my net over him, and he'll be caught in my snare. He's going to try to escape. He's going to pack up all his baggage just like I told you to do. He's going to cut a hole in the wall just like I told you to do. He's going to try to flee and leave everybody to suffer. But he says, don't worry about it. I'm going to catch him like a bird in a snare. He's not getting very far. Zedekiah is not going to get away with it. So he says, I'll catch him like a net in a snare, and I will bring him to Babylon in the land of the Chaldeans, yet he will not see it, though he will die there. All right, now here's the... this is the big reason why the children of Israel, or the Jerusalemites and the Judahites, this is a big reason why they thought they were safe. Remember that one of their arguments is it's going to be fleshed out in more detail, but one of their arguments is, but Jeremiah says we're going to be okay. Ezekiel says I'm going to Babylon. And so Zedekiah and all his people are sitting around, and they're saying, okay, over here's Ezekiel, and he's prophesying, and he's saying that God is going to round us all up and take us into Babylon as captives. All right, that's one prophecy. Then over here, Jeremiah's prophesying, saying, you won't see Babylon. To Zedekiah, you're not going to see Babylon. And so Zedekiah and all his people that are evil and wicked are sitting around and go, okay, we got two prophecies. We got two predictions. Which one of them should we believe? Are we going to believe Ezekiel's prophecy, which says that we're going to Babylon as captives? Or are we going to believe Jeremiah's prophecy that says we'll never see Babylon? And so you got to make a choice. So if it's me and you, which choice do we make? I choose Jeremiah. I'm going to believe that guy, because this guy says, I'm not going to Babylon. I'll never see Babylon. That's his prophecy. He doesn't say he's not going there. He says he's not going to see there. Not going to see the land of Babylon. That's why he tells Ezekiel, when you go out, cover your face so you won't see the land. It's a pedagogy and biography. He's acting out what's going to happen to Zedekiah and those rebellious Jews in Jerusalem. And he says, I want you to pack your bags, cut a hole in the wall, cover your face, sneak out. It's exactly what Zedekiah tries to do. This is a prophecy of it. Zedekiah is actually going to try to do it. So you read the Bible and you think it's contradictory. Ezekiel says he's going to Babylon as a captive. Jeremiah says he's not going to see Babylon. And so people that don't really study and people that don't really put a lot of thought into this will say the Bible's contradictory. It's teaching two different things. But let me tell you what happens, what literally happens. God catches Zedekiah. He's trying to sneak out through that hole in the wall. God throws a net over to capture him out there. You know, God gets him like he said he was going to do. And then he starts to be deported toward Babylon, just like Ezekiel prophesied. Ezekiel said, you're going to Babylon as a captive. And so he's going to Babylon as a captive. I mean, he's caged up and all these kind of things. And then when they get to this, as they're marching along, when they get to this city called Riblah, there's I don't know if it was like a little dust up, you know, with armies, or if Zedekiah just kept talking too much and wouldn't shut up, or whatever it was. But when they get to this town called Riblah, they gouge his eyes out. And so he's going to go into Babylon as a captive, but he's not going to see a thing. And so now the prophecy of Ezekiel and the prophecy of Jeremiah both come true. And Zedekiah's over there thinking, I probably need to believe Jeremiah because he says I'll never see the land. Ezekiel says I'm going to be captive. But in the end, God worked it out so that both prophecies were true, and Zedekiah got taken down. All right, and so that's this pedagogy and biography that Ezekiel is teaching to these people. Josephus, a first century historian that writes a lot about first century stuff, biblical stuff, he writes a lot about this episode, about the events at Riblah and all that. All right, so that's how this little piece plays out. Now look at verse 14. Verse 14 and 15, God says, I will scatter to every wind all who are around him, his helpers, all his troops, and I will draw out a sword after them. So they will know that I am the Lord when I scatter them among the nations and spread them among the countries. So God says, after I do this to Zedekiah, I'm going to scatter the Jews that accompanied him or assisted him. All those, so you got all these Jerusalemites that are in Jerusalem that are sitting around saying, okay, I hear Ezekiel, I hear what he's saying. You know, we got this idol up right outside the inner court of the temple. No big deal. God's going to give us a pass on that because we're in Jerusalem. This is God's place, you know. And so they're all sitting around talking about this. Zedekiah comes along, who is an illegitimate king. Jehoiakim's the real king. Zedekiah just kind of forces himself in, starts all this evil, wicked stuff. Then when the Babylonians do come in 587 BC, he tries to escape through a hole in the wall. God catches him. They start leading him to Babylon. At Riblah, he gets his eyes gouged out. So when he gets there, he can't see anything. And now God turns around and says to Ezekiel, I'm not done yet, because all those folks that helped him, now I'm coming after them. And I'm not going to necessarily take them out right now, but I'm going to scatter them. There's going to be a diaspora of these Jews, one of many of the Jewish people. And he says, I'm going to take care of them that way. A lot of them, look what God says, I'm going to send a sword after them. So that means they're running for their life, all these rebellious Jews, and they're scattered to other nations. A lot of times in Israel's history, the Jews get scattered. God gives them Palestine. So he says to Abraham, that's your land. And so ever since then, that land's been in dispute. It's a little bitty tract of land. But they're fighting over it ever since. Every now and then, the Jews in Jerusalem, hadn't happened since 48, but the Jews in Jerusalem will get scattered for some reason. 722, the Assyrians came in. 587, the Babylonians came in. In 70 AD, the Romans came in, destroyed the temple. Emperor Titian put a board over the eastern gate because he felt like, well, maybe if Jesus does come back, that's where he's supposed to come. So we'll board him out. You know, this piece of wood's going to keep Jesus out, you know, kind of thing. And so every so often during Israel's history, the Jewish people scatter all over the world. They're in South America, they're in Africa, they're in Europe, they're in America. It's always called a diaspora of Jews, the scattering out of the Jewish people. And then God always has a miraculous movement where the people of Israel go back home. Zionism. They go back to their homeland. This is one of those diasporas that Ezekiel is prophesying. He says Zedekiah's going to go out, God's going to catch him, he's going to be blinded, and all these good things. But all those people that help him, God says, they're going to be chased away. They'll be scattered out, and they're going to be all over the place. That's 14 and 15. Look at verse 16. But I will spare a few of them. I'm going to hold a few of them back from the sword and the famine and the pestilence, that they may tell all their abominations among the nations where they go, and may know that I am the Lord. So why is he going to spare a few? He's going to spare a few of them. Some of these people that helped Zedekiah, he's going to chase them down. They're going to scatter all over. Some of them's going to be killed. But God said, I'm going to spare some of them. Look at the reason. So they can tell people not just what happened, but he says, tell them about their abomination. In other words, God said, I'm going to spare some of these people so that they can say that the reason all this happened is because we were rebellious and wasn't following God. We had these idols set up in the temple. You know, we were in false worship, idol worship, all that stuff. And then God sent this upon us. In other words, God's not arbitrary. God is not capricious. God is not just punitive. We deserve what we got. So God said, I'm going to spare some of them so that happens. That's and honestly, the deportations, being carried away like that, are not designed to show that God is mad. It's not designed to show that God hates them. It's designed to show that God is faithful and that God is loving and that God is all powerful over everything and that God will do whatever he has to do to bring his people back to himself. It's a restoration. That's why I always tell y'all, God's judgment is never punitive. God doesn't go after us just for the fun of it. God's not sitting in heaven. He's like, I ain't got nothing to do today. I'm going to make Jeff's life miserable today. If God chastises me, it is for the simple reason that I've strayed and God's trying to get me back. It's restorative, always restorative. And so God said, I'm saving these people. I'm going to spare this group of people so that they can go out and tell why all this happened, because the whole point of this whole thing is to get Israel back to where they need to be. I want them to come home. I want them to be in Israel, in Palestine. That's where they're supposed to be. That's what God has said. I need them there. That's where they're supposed to be. But they've got to do some things first. They've got to be committed and faithful to me. He says, I'll be their God. They'll be my people, kind of thing. But it's a kind of a two-way street. You know, I always say, once saved, always saved. I think I told y'all this Sunday, but it's also once saved, always obedient, always following. We have to follow. And when we don't follow, we get chastised until we're brought back into the fellowship or into the following. And that's what he's trying to do to these people. Now look at verse 17 through 20. This is the third section of chapter 12. It talks about eating. All right, so if that's your thing, then these verses will be good for you. So look at verse 17. Moreover, the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Son of man, eat your bread with trembling, and drink your water with quivering and with anxiety. Look at verse 18. Oh, I'm sorry, 18. Son of man, eat your bread with trembling, drink your water with quivering, with anxiety. He told Ezekiel to eat like that. Trembling, anxiety. Evidently, this is the same provision that God gave to Ezekiel back in chapter 4. And he said, I want you to eat it like this because I'm trying to prove a point, and he's going to get to that point in verse 19. Look at verse 19. Then say to the people of the land, Thus saith the Lord God concerning the inhabitants of Jerusalem in the land of Israel, they will eat their bread with anxiety and drink their water with horror, because their land will be stripped of its fullness on account of the violence of all who live in it. The inhabited cities will be laid waste, and the land will be a desolation, so you will know that I am the Lord. He's trying to explain to those Jews that they were going to eat and drink like him, because God is going to strip their land of all abundance. He's going to get rid of. In other words, the people had committed so much violence contrary to the law of God that God is now going to strip the land of everything. He's going to desolate the cities of Judah. He's going to desolate the city of Jerusalem. And then look what he said. Then the people are going to know that I am the Lord God. I am God. And this is the whole point. Just like our earthly children. Here's the point. God is saying to them, by doing these things, everybody is going to know that I'm the God who loves these people, because I'm willing to discipline them. That's why I'm doing it. And so God said, I'm not doing it because I'm mad at them. He's frustrated with them, I'm sure. But he's saying, I'm doing this because I'm in disciplining these people. Everybody else, all these other countries and nations and tribes and tongues, they're going to see that these are the people that I love. I love them because I discipline them. I don't discipline other people's kids. I mean, I love them. I love all the kids in this church, but I don't discipline them. I mean, I would if I saw them doing something that's dangerous or something that's really disrespectful. But I discipline my children. God gave them to me to discipline and to raise a certain way. And so God says, I'm doing this because I want people to see that there's a discipline issue going on. Then let's wrap this up. Verses 21 through 28 is the last section of this thing. And it's the context of it is the judgment of God as evidence of God's faithfulness. His judgment is actually evidence of it. And so we're going to divide chapter verses 21 through 28 into two parts. The first part is 21 through 25. Look at those two. Then the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Son of man, what is this proverb the people have concerning the land of Israel, saying, the days are long, and every vision fails. Therefore say to them, Thus says the Lord God, I will make this proverb cease, so that they will no longer use it as a proverb in Israel. But tell them, the days draw near, as well as the fulfillment of every vision. For there will be no longer any false vision or flattering divination within the house of Israel. For I, the Lord, will speak, and whatever word I speak will be performed. It will no longer be delayed, for in your days, O rebellious house, I will speak the word and perform it, declares the Lord God. So this section has two prophecies. That's the first. Look what he says to them. Look at verse 21 through 22. God said, tell me about this proverb that the people are saying. I know they got this saying. It's kind of like a teacher asking some of her students, tell me what people are saying behind my back. What are they calling me when they're out in the hallway? God says, tell me what this proverb is. What are they saying? And then God goes on to tell him the proverb, tells him what they're saying. But look what they say. They're saying the days are long and God's vision or Ezekiel's vision's failed. That's the proverb. That's what they're saying. When they're talking around Jerusalem, when they're talking around town, they're saying, hey man, I know Ezekiel talks like this is imminent, but we got a long time. We got a long time to worry about this. God's not going to do nothing with us right now. Everything's okay. The vision of Ezekiel is no good. It's just false. It's what people say today. People say, I know what those Christians say, that God can come back anytime and all that. And so they're sitting around their dinner tables and they're like, I heard y'all say that God can come back anytime, but really, I don't believe that. I believe we got all time in the world. I believe it can last forever. And then what if Jesus comes back before they get that next bite out of their mouth? That's what he's saying to them. The captivity that true prophets are prophesying. Jeremiah, Isaiah, Ezekiel during this time. The proverb around Israel was, that's a long way away. We don't have to worry. Our grandkids might have to worry about it, great-grandkids, but we ain't have to worry about that. We're okay. Then look at verse 25. God said, tell them the time is near. I'm about to do what I said. Really what it says is without delay. There's no more delay in this. I told them I was going to come for them, and I'm going to come for them. That's the end of the first prophecy of that section. Look at the second one. Look at verse 26. Furthermore, the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Son of man, behold, the house of Israel is saying, the vision that he sees is for many years from now, and he prophesies of times far off. Therefore say to them, thus says the Lord God, none of my words will be delayed any longer. Whatever word I speak will be performed, declares the word of the Lord. Some people are saying that the prophecies about coming judgment were true, but a long time away. God says, not so. There's no more delay. I'm coming for you. And the Babylonians are not too far away, and they'll be coming. So Ezekiel is called to do this pedagogy and biography. He's going to saddle up his stuff, dig a hole in the wall, and leave to show people what it's going to be like. Zedekiah tries it. God catches him. And then God promises the rest is going to happen. Remember, all these, chapter 12 through chapter 19, are excuses. They're all excuses. Each one's an excuse. This is why we don't believe you, Ezekiel. And then Ezekiel has to go through a lot of trouble to say, this is why you should believe me. You guys have a false sense of security. And so that's chapter 12. Next week, we're going to look at chapter 13. And it's another one of these false prophecies or false securities that's coming. Any questions about all this? Chapter 12. Anybody? Well, all right. Made it clear as mud. I'm going to for all you guys that are watching us online, I'm going to sign off now. Thank you for being with us. We invite you to come Sunday at 10:15, please. This Valentine's Day, no better day to start back in God's house. You can social distance, wear a mask, and we'll do all we can to protect you here. But try to join us. We're having a children's church Sunday. So I know you want to be here. Please come and you'll be blessed. If you can't make it, watch us online and try to join us again next Wednesday night. But we appreciate it. Thank y'all for being with us.